Hi, welcome back to this channel. My name's Rebecca, and if you're here, you have most likely seen my first video about coronavirus in general. In the first video that I made in March, we talk about coronavirus, what a virus actually is, why it makes sense to stay at home, and we basically talked about all of the basics of the pandemic we have at hand right now. And today we're going to talk about vaccination. We're going to talk about the new vaccination for COVID-19, and we're also going to talk a little bit about mutations, although everything that I said in March is still true today. If you haven't been here before, my name is Rebecca, and why am I talking about this? That is a very good question. I have a bachelor's degree in a subject called molecular biotechnology, and I'm also a graduate student at the University of Heidelberg here in Germany, pursuing a master's degree in that same subject as well. So I may not be a virologist, so that is not my specialty, but my specialty is biophysical chemistry. I learned all of the basics to understand everything about everything I'm talking about today in my bachelor's degree. At the very end of the video, I'll be talking about some questions that are more speculative and not exactly in my field of expertise, but that is clearly marked in the description box or in the timestamps. You'll see which questions are speculative at the very end of the video. Up until then, I am very sure of what I'm talking about. If you're watching this video, I would highly recommend you definitely watch the part about the immune system, the vaccine in general, and that if you're trying to understand the side effects of the vaccine, especially the long-term side effects, I really would recommend you watch the first two parts. I know I have the timestamps in here, and it might seem like a good idea to jump forward because it is such a long video, but believe me, it's going to make a lot more sense if you watch most of the first part. In order to understand what a vaccination does, or what this specific vaccination does, we have to understand what the immune system does. And I'm a pretty big fan of our immune system. I actually find it one of the most fascinating fields in science because it is so specific. Our immune system basically has the big objective of seeing what belongs to our body and what does not belong to our body. So it tries to recognize when something enters the body, does this belong to me or does this not belong to me? Is this harmful or is this not harmful? So when something first enters our body, our first immune response will be an unspecific response, meaning that the first thing that will happen is that we just try to figure out what it is. And if we take coronavirus as an example, then coronavirus itself has different protein that are basically on the virus. One of these proteins is called spike protein, and that is basically what our body uses to recognize, oh, this does not belong to us, and I should probably have an immune response to this and make sure that we get this out. And our first response is going to be unspecific, and then while that unspecific immune response is happening, basically, a specific immune response starts in the background, and this immune response is really specific. It is perfectly tailored toward the virus that has come into our body, which I find pretty amazing. You can imagine this like neighborhood watch in comparison to the police. So neighborhood watch probably, patrols around in the evening and tries to see if they can find threats somewhere in their neighborhood. And that's basically our unspecific immune response. They try to look for threats in the body. And once they find something, and once they figure out, oh, I can't handle this by myself, they will call the police, which is the specific immune response. So that's basically the unspecific versus specific immune response. The specific immune response also has two types of answers. And this is due to the fact that we have pathogens, so like viruses, for example, that will roam free in the body, and we have pathogens that will go inside of our bodily cells. So if we take coronavirus as an example, a virus will come into our body, and at first it's going to be like floating around in our bodily fluids between the cells. And then, after a while, it will infect the cells and go inside them. So one part of the immune response, the humoral immune response, is responsible for the virus that is just floating around freely in the bodily fluid. And the cellular immune response, on the other side, is that immune response that is specific to cells that have already been infected. So body-owned, my cells that have been infected. Our cells have this awesome mechanism where they basically present the fact that they were infected. So when a cell in our body is infected, it will signal to the outside, hey, I was infected by a virus, please kill me, to make sure that I'm not making any more viruses, which is actually pretty cool. Imagine that, a system that says to others, please kill me so I don't kill you. So part of the humoral immune response are antibodies, which of course we hear a lot about. So antibodies are basically there to bind free roaming viruses, and we can basically imagine that they really just bind the viruses together so they can't go into any cells, and then later they get eaten by different kinds of immune cells. The other type of cells that are produced in the humoral immune response are B lymphocytes, which are basically a type of immune cell, and they have different functions. Some of them aid antibodies and make sure that they are also eating free roaming stuff, and some of them actually produce antibodies, so they can have different functions throughout the immune response. On the other side, on the cellular immune response that is targeting cells that were infected, we basically have T killer cells. And yes, this is not a joke, they're called killer cells. And these T killer cells are also immune cells, and they basically scout and look out for those cells that were infected, and they'll kill them. There's several different mechanisms on how they can do that, just to make sure that there's no more virus reproducing in that cell. But the main thing to understand about immune responses in order to understand vaccination is the fact that at the end of all of these immune responses, we make B and T memory cells. So basically these are cells that will accelerate the immune response. Before, when I was talking about the unspecific versus specific immune response, I said that neighborhood watch had to be roaming around, and then once neighborhood watch found the threat, they would call the police. But making memory B and T cells is basically like having the police around right away. So once you have coronavirus a second time, once you get that virus the second time, memory B and T cells are ready to act right away. They will replicate and they will do their thing. They will activate the specific immune response immediately, and they're able to work a lot faster. And that's basically the mechanism that vaccinations use. Vaccinations will give you the antigen, so they will give you that thing with which you can recognize this does not belong to me in order to have an immune response. Meaning that with the coronavirus vaccine, for example, in some form, we will get the spike protein on the coronavirus because that's the antigen. That is what our immune cells recognize as, ooh, this doesn't belong to me. I need to respond to this. Then we have a whole immune response, and at the end of these immune responses, we have B and T memory cells. So the next time we do get coronavirus, we already have those cells and we can react to that threat immediately, right away. And that is why we don't get sick after getting a vaccination, because we have memory B and T cells. Now, in order to understand the vaccination for this specific coronavirus or this specific illness, COVID-19, we have to take another small detour because the mechanism of this vaccination is fairly new. It's not new in science. We've been researching this for decades, and we've known for decades that this is a wonderful method for making vaccinations, but it is the first of its kind to actually be brought out to the public. But that doesn't mean it is less safe. But we will get to that later. Before we can talk about what it exactly does, we have to understand two other words first. We have to understand DNA and especially mRNA. Now, DNA, we have all learned, is this long molecule that has information in it. And this information encodes protein. So DNA has information in form of 4 different letters, and it has like a code in it. It's like its own little genetic code that we have deciphered a few decades ago. And this code essentially encodes like the order of amino acids. Now, amino acids is a whole subject for itself, so we're not going to go into that. But what we can remember is that a protein is made of amino acids. So the DNA has the code for the order of amino acids, and out of this chain of amino acids, a protein is made. And that's basically what our DNA is. So it has information for lots of protein. And we need this information in order to survive. All of the stuff we do inside of our body is done with the help of protein. and enzymes, which are a form of active protein. And that's why it is so important that our DNA stay in the exact code that it is in. Because the DNA needs to be secured a bit, DNA doesn't roam freely inside of a cell. We always have like a subcompartment called the nucleus inside of a cell. And DNA is inside of this nucleus in order for it to be just more protected from the rest of the cell. So you can basically think of DNA like always in its own room inside of the house, inside of the cell. It has its own little compartment and it always stays in there. But protein isn't made inside that nucleus. It is not made inside that room. So you can basically imagine your grandma can't leave the bed anymore. She's always in her room. And because she's always in her room, she needs someone to help her take stuff out and inside of the room. And that's where mRNA comes in. So RNA sounds pretty familiar. It sounds a lot like DNA. And basically it is an easier form or a more simple form of DNA. It can carry the same information, but on a molecular level, it's a little simpler. And the M actually stands for messenger. So it is a messenger between the DNA and the outside of the nucleus inside of the cell in order to make protein. So mRNA will carry the information on the DNA from inside the nucleus to the rest of the cell so protein can be made. And that's what mRNA does. Now this vaccination is so fascinating because instead of giving you the spike protein, so remember that antigen on top of the virus, instead of giving you that spike protein directly, it will actually give you mRNA. So when we get injected with the vaccination, we get mRNA into our body. And we produce the spike protein ourselves, which basically means we make the vaccination ourselves inside the body, which I find super fascinating. What a cool thing to do. They give you this injection of mRNA and you just do it all yourself. So you make that antigen, you make the spike protein, you have a full immune response against the spike protein. And should you contract the virus through any other way, you already have your memory cells and you can easily get rid of the illness. That's basically how the vaccination works, and I find that personally really fascinating. But of course, a lot of people have a lot of questions about side effects, and especially long-term side effects. But before we talk about long-term side effects, we're going to talk about the side effects that we actually saw in the study. But before I even talk about that, I just want to mention one more thing. Every medication, every pill in this world that actually helps you get better has side effects. Any effective medication has side effects because being effective means having side effects. People are always different. People are always going to react differently to different types of medication. And medication always means that we're doing something with the body and people are just going to have bad responses to that. Now, what we find out with studies is we try to make sure that the side effects really outweigh the benefits of whatever medication it is, but any medication that claims to not have side effects also means that that medication has no effect. So we need to always keep this in mind. No matter what medication you are taking, side effects is a part of the deal. If you want to get better, you have to live with the possibility of side effects. So for this part, I'm going to have to look at my computer every so often, just so you know. But talking about clinical trials of medication, we have to understand that there's 3 different phases. So there's phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And phase 1 and 2 of clinical trials is always about the safety. So they're just looking at, is this medication killing anyone? Is this medication doing anything horrible? It just makes sure if the medication itself is safe. And in phase 3 is when we start looking at the actual benefit of medication. We start looking at the statistics and we actually try to figure out what this medication effectively does and what the side effects look like. So what I'm going to talk about is phase 3 clinical trial, and that's where I'm going to get all of these numbers from. So more than 40,000 people participated in the phase 3 clinical trial for the BioNTech Pfizer medication, and it was a randomized double-blind study, which is absolutely the scientific standard for these types of studies. Randomized means that the 40,000 people, more than 40,000 people that participated in the study were split into two groups. One group that received a placebo and one group that actually received the medication. And they were randomly distributed into one of those groups. Double-blind means that the patients didn't know what they were getting, so they didn't know whether they were in the placebo group or in the medication group. And doctors administering the vaccination also didn't know. And we do this in science to make sure that there's no bias, so patients don't start feeling more or less sick depending on the group they're in, just to make sure that nobody's just thinking up symptoms. So this is the scientific standard on how to do studies. So that, of course, means that there were more than 20,000 people that got a placebo and more than 20,000 people that actually got the vaccination. In order to show whether the vaccine is actually effective, we look at how many people contracted COVID-19 in the placebo group as compared to how many people contracted COVID-19 in the actual vaccination group. And this was, I think, 162 people in the placebo group versus 8 people in the vaccination group. These numbers are then used to figure out the actual efficacy of the study. And the efficacy with these numbers is 95%, and that is where that number comes from. Some people wanted to have this number, this efficacy, compared to other studies. So the measles vaccination has an efficacy of 95 to 98%, the FSME vaccination of 95%, and the flu vaccination, which is very different though. So this is not really comparable because the flu vaccination is of course seasonal and it's basically a guessed vaccination, but more on that some other time. But the efficacy of the flu vaccination in the 2019-2020 season was 62%, so not as high. Like I said, that's not really comparable to the vaccine we're looking at now. Somebody just asked that, which is why I'm putting it in here. So we can see 95% is great. We want to work with 95%. That's actually way better than anybody expected, actually, it to be. So we're happy about that. This is a good thing. In the study, of course, they also looked at the side effects that they could find while administering the vaccine. And they divided it into 3 groups: local reactions, systemic reactions, and adverse events. And local reactions were common. We had, just like we know it from other vaccinations, up to 7 days after the injection, people experienced mild to moderate pain at the actual injection site. But with most people, this went away after 1 to 2 days after the actual injection. Systemic reactions, there were more systemic reactions after the second injection. I haven't mentioned this. So the coronavirus vaccine is administered at 2 points. You get one vaccine, the first injection, and then 3 weeks later you get the second injection, and then both of those combined are your vaccine against COVID-19. Systemic reactions were also pretty much what you expect. So there was a lot of fatigue. People experienced being tired, fatigued after getting the injection, which makes sense because we have an immune response ongoing. They had headaches, which is also to be expected. And they also found that fever was a side effect. This was only in 0.2 patients of the non-placebo group after first injection and 0.8% after the second injection. So this is still very mild. I'm going to put the exact numbers on the corner. Now, adverse events is something you always have to take with a grain of salt, because what I have learned is that adverse events, in order to make sure that a vaccine is as safe as possible, while we have a clinical study, anything that happens to you in that time is an adverse event. So even if you break your leg while you're in a clinical study, breaking your leg is going to be an adverse event. So take these numbers with a grain of salt. It sounds a lot when I say the adverse events, that there were altogether 27% of people experienced adverse events. However, like I said, you have to look at the adverse events that are related to the vaccine and that are non-related to the vaccine. And at the end of each study, different doctors and scientists look at these results and try to figure out, okay, what makes sense? What is actually in relation to the vaccine and what isn't? So something that was related and seemed to be an issue was this word. I have to put it in because I forgot to actually write down the actual word here. But people basically had very, very swollen lymphatic glands. They needed further treatment for that, but that was only in 0.3% of people that got the vaccine. So it's still not a lot we're talking about. There were only 4 serious adverse events in the non-placebo group, so in the group that got the vaccination. And from 21,000 people, that is really good. I mean, 4 out of more than 21,000 people is a lot. And I will put in the corner what exactly the events were, but as you can see, one of them is an injury at injection, so related is relative. So what does this tell us? This is really good, and this is pretty much what we expected. As we talked about before, a vaccination basically means an immune response to an antigen, so an immune response to something that in this case we make ourselves. So you're going to see those typical symptoms of having a cold or having the flu, such as fatigue or headaches, even fever sometimes, or just not feeling well in general. That is absolutely to be expected of a vaccine. No reason, scientifically, no reason to believe that a large amount of people will have serious reactions to this vaccine. As we can see, there were only 4 serious adverse events related to the vaccine, and one of them was a shoulder injury. So there is no reason to believe that there are going to be serious issues with this vaccine. Now comes the topic of long-term side effects. So before I start talking about long-term side effects, we have to understand what that word actually means. And usually long-term side effects are the long-term consequences of a side effect that occurred immediately. So that means that if these people that I mentioned before that had the swollen lymphatic glands, if those people experience more pain or more infections of their lymphatic glands the rest of their life, then that is a long-term side effect. But as you can tell, it was a side effect we saw immediately that had long-term consequences. If you look at other medication, you can even see stroke in some of these side effects, the very, very rare side effects, of course. But if someone experiences a stroke after taking medication, that is going to have long-term implications for that person. And that is usually what a long-term side effect is. And I think right now, a lot of people are scared that nothing will happen at first, and then in 5 or 10 years, they're all of a sudden going to get sick from something from this vaccine. And that scenario is extremely unlikely due to the nature of what is in that vaccination. So basically due to the nature of mRNA. This is actually an extremely unlikely scenario because mRNA is not very stable in our body. While you're sitting here watching this video, and while I'm sitting here filming this video, we have millions and millions of mRNA strands in our body at this moment because we are all the time making new protein in our cells. mRNA in and of itself, we couldn't have a lot of it because it basically would just be too crowded in our cells, and we really only need it to go from one place to the other, and then we're done with it. So our body is actually really efficient and good and quick at degrading mRNA, and it does that every second, all the time we're degrading mRNA. So it actually doesn't have a very long life in our body. And one of the biggest challenges working on this vaccine over the past decades was actually just figuring out how to make this mRNA stay in our body long enough for us to build an antigen. So that was one of the main concerns of this type of vaccine, was just figuring out how to make it last just a little bit longer, just enough so we can make that antigen. Science's solution to make it a little longer lasting was basically to put it into lipids. So put it into a little capsule of lipids and make sure it's protected by fat, basically. Our body makes no distinctions between fat that is produced synthetically and fat that is produced naturally, as some people would say. It's basically like drinking tap water and buying water. If you live in a region where the tap water is good and the quality is good, your body doesn't care if it's tap water or bottled water. It's going to use it the way it uses water. It's the same principle as the ingredients used in this vaccination. Whether mRNA is made synthetically or by your body, it's disintegrated quickly. Whether the fat, the lipids used for this vaccination are made in a machine or made in us, it doesn't distinguish between the two. So because mRNA just literally can't survive in our body for long, it makes no sense that it would just suddenly do something in 5 years or in 10 years. And because we have so much mRNA in our body all the time, it also doesn't make any sense that mRNA would integrate into our DNA. Our DNA is very, very well protected. And if you imagine all of those mRNA strands that are in your body right now, if you imagine all of those could potentially go into your DNA just that easily, that would be devastating. We wouldn't exist as a people. And so that scenario is also so unlikely to nearly impossible that that is really not something you should worry about. There are, however, questions to science that we should be watching out for, that you should maybe be watching out for in the media. One of those is how long this vaccination lasts, basically. How long that protection against COVID-19 you actually have. We don't know how long this vaccination will last. If you think of other vaccinations you've gotten, you know that you've probably had some refresher vaccinations, and we don't know when we need that refresher or if we ever need a refresher vaccine for COVID-19. So that's something we still have to figure out. The other thing is we're not 100% sure if you can still infect other people. We know through this study definitely that it is very unlikely for you to contract COVID-19 and get sick of it. However, you can still be infected by the virus. You're just protected by your immune system of getting sick. So there might still be a chance that you could infect other people, although it is less likely than without the vaccine. The other question is, will we be able to give this vaccine to different types of our population? Because once medication is approved, it is really only approved for that part of the population that it was tested on. And in this study, we only tested it on healthy people over the age of 16 and also over the age of 50. So we still had some older people in that group to make sure that we could actually give it to senior citizens to make sure it was safe for them. But as of now, it is only safe for healthy people that we know of. So it has not been tested on children, so children cannot get this vaccine, and pregnant people can't get the vaccine, and people that have certain preconditions also cannot have this vaccine. So it's mostly only for healthy people, which makes it all the more important for healthy people to get it to protect these other parts of the population. To wrap up the subject of long-term side effects, I just want to tell you one thing. There's always going to be people who will react badly to medication, no matter what it is. When we give out this vaccination slowly to millions and millions and millions of people, we're going to see more side effects that are more serious. That is just statistics. That's what happens because each person is individual. Every person is different and every person will react differently. And maybe the media will talk about some of these cases, but I really, really want to ask you to always put it into perspective. So if 1 million people have gotten the vaccination and 100 of those have gotten sick or had serious side effects, then please keep in mind that 100 out of 1 million is a very small number. And so the probability of you actually getting that serious side effect is also very, very low. Please always keep that in mind. When you hear media reports about side effects or any other things, please keep in mind the total number and always put those two together before you get worried about other things. I know it is worrying to hear about all of these things, but we have side effects with every single medication out there. And you can look up the side effects for any kind of medication you are taking at this moment, and you'll probably see some very daunting and scary things, but that doesn't mean that they're going to affect you. Please always keep that in mind, and I hope that that little reminder helps. So another part of this whole vaccine business was how fast this vaccine was approved and how fast we developed it. And I can't be specific for the whole world. I can only be specific for the country that I live in, which is Germany. But I would also think the same things for the FDA in the United States. The reason why we were able to make a vaccine so fast is because it has just been that well researched. Number one, we knew a lot about coronavirus. This is just a new version of a big family of coronavirus that has already existed. And we have so much research on the coronavirus family that we were able to find a target for vaccination really, really quickly. Basically, scientists just had to figure out that the target that they would have taken anyway was still the correct target. So that is one reason why it was so fast. And the second reason was because we already knew so much about this type of vaccination, about mRNA vaccination. This method was so well researched that it was really easy to put two and two together and just make a vaccine really quickly. You can think of this vaccine as modular, so they basically just had to figure out if the one module, if that mRNA was correct or not. And so it was really, really easy on the science side, just because there already was so much research. In that sense, we were just really lucky that it was coronavirus that did it, because we knew so much about this virus beforehand. The other question is, how could this vaccination be approved so quickly and still do everything right? And I absolutely understand that question, but if we look back, and we hear all these people say that it usually takes decades for a vaccine to be approved, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it takes decades to make sure a vaccine is safe, because approving a vaccine, there's a lot more factors in that process. Mainly bureaucracy, money, finding patients to work with, and production. And I think we can all agree that money was definitely not a problem, because everything was funded immediately, and usually funding is a really big issue. Secondly, we could find patients to work with really, really quickly, because everyone knew about coronavirus and everyone wanted to get rid of this pandemic as quickly as possible. Production was also started a lot earlier. Usually, of course, production only starts after the vaccine has been approved, but this time it actually started before it was approved. And basically the companies took on that financial risk to just hope that they have the right vaccine in their hands. Bureaucracy is another big factor, and I just want to, if you've ever gone to some official government office, you probably know the situation. You only need a stamp or a signature or someone to just fill out something quickly. So the thing itself usually doesn't take a long time, but actually getting there and getting someone to look at it takes forever. That's always the part of bureaucracy that takes a long time. And everyone knew about this pandemic. Everyone wanted to get rid of this thing. So the COVID-19 vaccines just had absolute priority number one. So I don't think that the people at the FDA or the Paul-Ehrlich-Institut in Germany worked less hard on approving the vaccine. So I don't think that they ignored things that they would have otherwise not ignored. I think they just had it on their top number one priority and just did everything they could to do everything they needed to do in order to approve the vaccine first, before anything else. So no, it wasn't approved too quickly and people weren't overlooking any details. They just all collectively worked together. Isn't it amazing what can happen when bureaucracy just is fast? It's amazing. There are rumors out there that, for example, you would get genetic damage through this mRNA vaccine because mRNA might go into DNA, and we talked about that before, that is extremely unrealistic, if not impossible scenario. And another rumor I've heard is about infertility, that you become infertile if you get the vaccine. And actually infertility and vaccines is a rumor that for some reason always comes up with vaccines. ISIS even has this rumor that vaccines are just a plot of the West to make Muslim men infertile. So please don't take these seriously. No matter what you do, just don't take them seriously. I have a German article down below that I can link. I'll try to find an American one that talks about the specifics of all of this. I'm basically just telling you that is fake news. There is no reason to believe this. We have talked about it now. Just no. If you have allergies, somebody asked me if they should go, they have a lot of allergies, then I would just say talk to your doctor. I also have allergies against some types and forms of medication, and I basically have medical documentation of that. I will talk to my doctor beforehand and make sure that none of the things that I am allergic to are in the vaccine, so that is not a problem. If you have allergies, there's no reason to believe that this vaccine will trigger any new allergies. There's no reason to believe that this is something you're going to be especially allergic to. So just make sure you have your documentation along, whatever. In Germany, you have an Allergiepass, so like a little book that has all of your allergies in it. Just take that along to your either vaccination date or talk to your doctor beforehand, because they should be able to get the ingredient list of the vaccine and make sure that everything is fine for you. But there's no reason to believe that this is going to give you more allergies or anything else. So at this point, we talked at length about the vaccination itself, and you see what a complicated topic this is. And next, we're going to talk about the mutation. And I've already talked about mutation in March, but just to quickly repeat, somebody asked how a mutation even comes to be. Why does it even mutate? How does it mutate? And basically, mutation happens when DNA replicates. In order to make new cells in our body, our cells will split. So out of one cell, we'll just make two. And in that process, we have to replicate the DNA and basically just make two pieces of DNA. And this process of replicating DNA, of making new DNA, no matter if it's a virus or a cell, always has a high likelihood of mutation, just because basically a mutation means that the code that I talked about before, that code has 4 letters, and a mutation means that one of those letters is incorrect. And that can happen easily. If you're looking at DNA that has millions and millions of letters on it, which yes is the case, then one being exchanged accidentally can happen. Now, with humans like us, we're very complicated, and it is very important for us in the evolutionary perspective that our DNA always stays the same. Because if one cell goes wrong, we could get cancer, for example. That is basically cancer. A mutation gone wrong in the cell, and then we have cancer. So for us, it is really, really important to survive to not have any mistakes in our DNA, so no mutations, which is why we as a species have a lot of mechanisms that will repair it. So we have a lot of different mechanisms to make sure that DNA is fine. But with viruses, that's very different, because with a virus, it doesn't really matter. A virus is not a living thing. It's basically just something that wants to replicate as often as possible. And when it's inside of you, when it's inside one of your cells, and it's replicating and making 10,000 copies of itself, who cares if 100 of those are incorrect? It's all about the masses, which is why it is a lot likelier for a mutation to occur in a virus than in our cells, for example, because we have mechanisms that try to repair it, and viruses really just don't care. They're like, who cares? Then 10,000 will die. I'll make 100,000. There you go. I don't care. So the question we have to ask concerning viruses and mutation is not, will a mutation occur? Because it definitely will. It's, when will the mutation occur, and which mutation will survive? Which mutation can go through that selection process and actually survive? And I mentioned in March that usually a mutation will survive if it is more infectious. So if there is a mutation that will make a virus more infectious to other people, that is the mutation that will live. Because basically, all a virus wants to do is replicate, and infect as many people as possible. So if there is a mutant that is especially infectious, that's what's going to happen. But it doesn't necessarily want to make the host, so us, sicker, because it wants to be able to survive in our body for as long as possible. A good virus doesn't kill you quickly. A good virus takes a long time to actually make you sick, makes you sick for as long as possible, and then hopefully doesn't kill you. And that's exactly what happened. So the mutation that we see in England, and there were other mutations before it, this is just the normal process, is way more infectious, but it's not more lethal. At least at this point, it's not more lethal than any of the mutations before, which makes sense because it's just more infectious, but it doesn't want to kill you quicker because then it would have less time to replicate. That's basically what has happened. The next question is, of course, whether the vaccine still works for the mutated virus, and science is still ongoing at this point, but from what we know and from the first tests, we can say yes, the vaccine should be effective against the mutation because the target that they tried to use, so the antigen, that spike protein that they used, is something that is very essential to the virus. It desperately needs that spike protein in order to infect us. And the more essential a protein, the less likely it mutates. Because if it mutates, it might be wrong and it might be less effective, and so then it dies. It should work for most of the mutations that we can find because we picked something that was so essential for the virus that it shouldn't mutate that. So up until now, yes. And we have a good chance that the vaccination will cover most of the mutations. We'll see. Now we're coming to a few questions that are going to be speculative answers or more my opinion of things. So this is not necessarily the sciencey part of this video, just so you know. The first question was whether I will have my vaccination or get it. And once it's my turn, yes, I'm going to get vaccinated, definitely. The other question was why we're not working on alternate medication instead of a vaccine. And I thought this was a great question. I can't talk about this in full length because that would be another 50-minute video, which we are at this point. Number one, we wanted to make sure that we would kill this virus, at its root. And that means taking it out of our population as soon and as quickly as possible, which is what a vaccination basically does against the virus. And the other thing is that a vaccine, in comparison to other things, is actually pretty safe. Normal medication, will always try to look at the whole cycle. Like, how does a virus come into the cell? What does it do in the cell? How does it use the components of our cell to replicate and make more of itself? In order to make normal medication or conventional medication, you have to take one of those steps and basically disrupt it. That makes it more likely that we're disrupting something that needs to happen in our cell. And that is why usually or sometimes if you take vaccinations and like normal conventional medication can actually have more side effects because it's disrupting more of our regular mechanisms in our cell. And a vaccination really just is activating your immune system. It really just is making a response in a controlled environment so you don't get sick of it. So actually, conventional medication can have more side effects, and also it's way more complicated in research because with vaccinations you really just need to find the right target, the right antigen, whereas with conventional medication you have to understand everything that the virus does and what it uses and different targets and points and make sure that that doesn't disrupt the cell too much. It's way more complicated. But I will link to articles below. Thank you to Anya, who is a part of my community on my German channel, and she sent me those articles. It was very interesting. So check that out if you're interested. Next question was whether corona could be like the flu and come up every year. Anything is possible in biology. However, corona and the flu are two very different viruses, so corona might not mutate as quickly as the flu does. The flu has a completely different system in the way it works, which makes it seasonal, and that doesn't seem likely with the coronavirus. However, anything is possible in biology. It really is. The next question was how long it's going to take until enough people are vaccinated. And this question is difficult because, well, I live in Germany, so I can really only say what would work for Germany. I have no idea what that would look like in different countries. And also, I'm a molecular bioscientist. I am not an epidemiologist, so there are some things that are just way out of my expertise, such as this question. My personal hope for Germany is, for where I live, is that we don't have to go into another lockdown in fall. That's what I personally hope. I think the spring and summer of this year is going to look similar to the spring and summer of 2020. So slowly coming out of lockdowns and life looking a little more normal. And I just hope that in fall we don't have to go into another full lockdown, and maybe it'll be enough to just wear masks and keep a distance and just not go to restaurants as often as we used to, etc., etc. So that's what I personally hope, but I do not know what's going to be correct for your country or wherever you live. This was a long one. Thank you so much for listening to me today, for taking the time out of your day to actually listen to this. So science is always ongoing, so it could be if you listen to this video sometime later, if you watch this video in a month or two or in a year, some of this information may be incorrect, so you are welcome to correct anything that is weird or not true anymore. But please remember to cite your sources. I have my sources all linked into the description box if you want to have a look at anything. Some of these things are basic bioscience things, so especially talking about the immune system or talking about how vaccinations in general work, that is mostly just basic knowledge. But yeah, thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I know this is a really long video, but it is just super complicated. It is very difficult to understand, and I understand that this can be very confusing, and I hope that this video helped make it a little more clear, or as clear as possible. So I hope you have a nice day, and see you soon.